Zoom, you will, I can move to full screen and y'all should be able to see it. Um, so if any problem happens, just let me know. You may recall a couple of years back, I gave a presentation about the research I was doing on Fort Velasco, the Mexican fort that had been built at the mouth of the Brazos River in 1832. And during that time, I found mention of another fort down the coast that was already in existence, that the dispatches that I found in the Bear Archives, there was some exchange between these two forts. And it was called Guadalupe or Barranco Colorado. And I wondered, what the hell is that? I had never heard of such a thing. So I began to look further in the Bear Archives, and then what you're about to see is the result of that research. Basically, what we found was that there was a similar fort built down the coast at the near the mouth of the Lavaca River, up at the head of Lavaca Bay. So let me go into this. This outpost was virtually unknown, in historical references. For example, if you look on Wikipedia or the Handbook of Texas, you will find 5 other forts of that era mentioned that the Mexicans, with varying degrees of success, tried to form, but you won't find anything on this one, number 6. But the name that they used in their dispatches for this particular point is Barranco Colorado, or also they called it formerly Comandancia Militar del Establecimiento de la Vaca. Got that now? Okay.
Establecimiento.
Yeah, that means establishment or military establishment. Now, y'all probably know this pretty well, so I'll hurry through it, but you know the story of Austin's colony, and this was his early map in 1822, and he does draw what he labels as the Arroyo La Vaca. You have to sort of zoom in to see the name. It's that little pale blue line there, and that ended up turning out to be the southwestern boundary of his colony, but he had drawn it on the map. So we're talking about the very corner, of the colony for Stephen F. Austin is where we're going to be talking about. You may also remember that in 1828, an accomplished Mexican officer, I think he was the lowest rank of general or in the army, but he was a somewhat of a scientist. He was trained as an engineer. He was in charge of the Mexican Artillery Academy in Mexico City when he was given a plum assignment to come to Texas and officially do a boundary examination of the boundary that had been established here for East Texas. I hope you can see my cursor. In 1819 by treaty with Spain, the Adams-Onis Treaty. And Mexico had agreed to that same boundary when they won their independence in 1821. And rumors reached Tehran and others that these Anglo-American immigrants into Austin's colony were not really respecting the Mexican laws or customs or language or religion like they sort of had tentatively agreed to when they signed up to be colonists in Austin's colony. And so his secret mission was to see what the heck was going on in Texas. Okay. What he found alarmed him. He had traveled from the area of Laredo to San Antonio to Gonzales to San Felipe de Austin, and then on to Nacogdoches, where he spent the summer of 1828 with many day trips or multi-day trips out to this border area. And then late in the year, he returned by the southern route through, he went back to Nacogdoches, but then he took the southern route down to Goliad and Victoria, and then back to Matamoros, and arriving just after the turn of the year into 1829. He took along with him some scientists and artists. Raphael Chauvel was a geologist. Jean-Louis Berlandier was a naturalist, and Jose Maria Sanchez was a artist and map maker. He wrote an extensive report for the Mexican politicians that caused them to pass this law of April 6, 1830, that called for a number of provisions, but one of these was sort of the military occupation of Texas, especially Austin's colony. And this is what really gave birth to 6 new military forts, or an attempt to form 6 new military forts in Texas in the period of 1830 to 1832. And I sometimes refer to these as the Tehran forts. After this period, he was actually made, the comandante, I forget the name, but he was in charge, both the military and political chief of the Eastern Interior provinces, which included Texas. And he set up his new headquarters at Matamoros. Stephen F. Austin continued to improve his maps. You may be familiar with this sort of famous map of his on the left. He sent information that Tehran had shared with him from Tehran's visit in 1828, and his own measurements. Many surveyors had been working for 9 years by 1830, and he had huge amounts of survey information he sent to this guy Tanner in Philadelphia, and drew up this map that it's a very nice map of Austin's colony, and it was the first map that had decent coastal geography, that was publicly and widely available. The right is a blow up of Austin's colony area. And you can see the Lavaca River here forming the extreme boundary. And on the other side of that eventually was what was called DeWitt's colony. You can also see the northern 4th colony of Stephen F. Austin, which is in the area of Bastrop and Austin, Texas today. But the first colony was this colony here, bounded by the Lavaca River here, the San Jacinto River on the other side, the San Antonio Road to Nacogdoches on the north, and the coast on the south. Over the next 7 years, multiple versions of this were published with using this base map, but just adding new towns and locations. Using the 1836 version of the map now, I have drawn on here the locations of military installations that Mexico had in this period. They had existing garrisons at Bear and at La Bahia. And they even had they had posted a few years before 1830, a few out at Nacogdoches. So the green circles represent the existing garrisons in 1830. But Tehran wanted to install 6 new forts. The first of these that he tried to form in April 1830 was Fort Tenochtitlan, up here high on the Brazos, just beyond the San Antonio Road, outside of Austin's colony. This was to be Tehran's new capital of Texas. The second one that he formed was down here on the coast at the northeastern corner of Galveston Bay at Anahuac, first forming Fort Anahuac, and then a small town grew up next to that, just called Anahuac, that is still there today. That was, yes, let me go back a second. I've made a mistake. The second one was our Barranco, Colorado, we're going to talk about tonight. It was just across the Lavaca River from Austin's colony, just literally yards outside the boundary. And the third that fall of 1830 was Anahuac, excuse me. In 1831, he founded Fort Terran at an important crossroads up here in East Texas, and Fort Lipantitlan down here low on the Nueces River in the south. And then the sixth fort, Fort Velasco, was founded at the Brazos River mouth in 1832, in the spring of 1832. It was the last of the six that they attempted to found, and it was the only one directly upon the coast, which was really a hard place to survive in those days because there was no fresh water, no game, no timber, lots of fish and oysters, but it was otherwise a hard place to eke out an existence in those days. So I've told you that story before, probably ad nauseum. I found just a few secondary references. So the structure of this presentation, I'm going to try to show you these first, even though these came later, and then my delving into primary references that clarify some of the details. But there was an early Jackson County history published in multiple articles in the Jackson County Clarion in 1880, and someone took all of those and typed them out in a single document, which survives. And these words are found there, and it says here, Captain Matt Lewis, I think it's really Nathaniel Lewis, and Captain S. Hatch, Sylvanus Hatch, owned a schooner called the Hedda that he had sent to New Orleans for some supplies. Some Mexican soldiers from the garrison on the west side of the Lavaca went down also, and we camped at Cox's Point. Next morning, we and the officers went aboard the vessel. Let's see, I can't see some of this because of the windows with you guys. Let me see if I can get this out of the way. Okay. Next morning, leaving the soldiers ashore, the officers wanted the captain to send some water ashore for the soldiers. And after repeating their wishes 2 or 3 times, the captain told the interpreter to tell them to go to hell, which made the officers furious. They drew their swords and the water went ashore, and nobody was hurt, though somewhat scared. The vessel was seized by the soldiers as having contraband on board and lay in the bay until she became a wreck. Research in the Bear Archives indicates this event may have occurred in early July of 1831. So you can see that this was a year after Barranco Colorado had been started, and undoubtedly what they're talking about is the Mexican soldiers from that fort just up the Lavaca River. Following up on that, this is an old map of Jackson County from 1840. And I want to point out to you that here is Lavaca Bay. This is Cox's Point. I think a man named Thomas Cox had the title to this property here. The current I-35 bridge comes right through there and across to this point where Port Lavaca exists today. And this area is an industrial complex today. But then you can see the Lavaca River entering the northeastern corner of Lavaca Bay, and the red star up here indicates the very proximate location where Barranco, Colorado was. So you can see that schooner Hedda tried to dock in here, and the soldiers came down and captured it. This is John Lynn's, from John Lynn's book, and he has quite a few words about this. It says, during this year, 1830, which is the context leads you to, General Terran sent 200 soldiers to establish a military post on the Lavaca River. This addition to our scant population gave a decided impetus to trade. I engaged to supply the troops with all articles suitable to their wants. There were in Victoria and on the Lavaca River above 200 soldiers who had been sent by the orders of General Terran in 1831. You'll see the meaning of this 1830 and 1831 later in my presentation. He had intended building a fort on the Lavaca. The definite position had not been decided upon, but the manufacture of brick had been commenced at a place called El Banco, Colorado, or the Red Bank, on the west bank of the Lavaca, about 3 miles west of Texana. These works were under the control of Don Manuel Chauvel, probably the same Raphael Chauvel that traveled with Terran in 1828, a gentleman of birth and education commissioned by General Terran. The immediate commander of the troops was Captain Arteaga, also a perfect gentleman and an old officer who had served throughout the Mexican Revolution. And then to sort of orient you again, this is a slightly later map, the Hunt-Randall map of 1839, that shows Texana here. Again, I hope you could see my cursor circulate it. Here's Lavaca Bay, you know, sort of an appendage of Matagorda Bay. And then this is the entrance to Matagorda Bay, often called Paso Caballo. Tox's Point is right here. Linville was a small port established here. Port Lavaca developed later, right in here, and that's where the current Highway 35 causeway, you know, crosses that bay today. Texana is actually shown here in the wrong spot. It's shown here on the left bank of the Lavaca River, but it really was on the west bank or right bank of the Navidad River over here, about where the E in Texana, the word Texana is. So this is slightly in the wrong place on this map. Let's see. This is a later map. It shows it's a map of Victoria County, which in those days, the Lavaca River was the boundary between Victoria and Jackson counties. It shows the town of Texana in its proper location. Let's see, I want to go back a slide or two. I guess I'm have these slightly out of order, but one of these documents suggests that Barranco, Colorado was on the section owned by John Lynn, you know, and the red arrow attempts to show you that southwest corner. You know, in a minute, I'm going to show you another map, the Lynn 1838 connected map of Victoria County, and it labels these roads here, you know, this lower road as the Texana Road. Here, the upper road is labeled as the Texana Road, but it doesn't seem to be heading to Texana. It looks like there's a road segment here that went to Barranco, Colorado, and then in the years after that, you know, this was abandoned and the Anglo-Americans developed the town of Santa Ana, later changed to Texana. And it looks like that road probably crossed the Lavaca River right about where Barranco, Colorado was, and then went on to Texana. So this was probably the original road to Barranco, Colorado, and then it was extended to Texana. Now, folks, for some reason, looks like I thought I'm missing a slide here, but there was a slide where I segue to primary documents. So I've shown you these few ephemeral references in secondary sources that seem to hint at a fort there, and it's about all I could find. But when I go back to the Bear archives, I found over 100 documents to or from Barranco, Colorado, and sometimes many more that mention Barranco, Colorado. And this particular one on the 1st of June, 1830 was very instructive because it actually labeled out instructions to this commander, Aniceto Arteaga, from Terran, who appears to have been some kind of micromanager. And he wrote him out these very detailed instructions that I have summarized here. So as you can see, one of his first instructions was to take 40 men from the 11th and 12th Permanent Battalions at Matamoros on a sloop called the General Bustamante, to the anchorage at the Lavaca River in La Bahia de San Bernardo. That was the old name for what we today call Matagorda Bay. He was to create a military establishment on the right bank on the property of Colonia de Guadalupe. This was the name for the Martin de Leon colony that was centered at Guadalupe, Victoria, today Victoria, Texas, with the purpose of keeping an eye on La Norte Americanos de Austin across the Lavaca while protecting both colonies from the aggressions of the savages. He was to be independent of the commander at La Bahia, but report his arrival to the state commander, a guy named Antonio Elisua, that was the commander for Texas, the province of Texas, stationed at San Antonio de Bexar, and to otherwise communicate directly to Tehran. He was to treat the North Americans with respect and contact Stephen F. Austin with honesty and enlightenment. He was to settle into the fort as soon as possible, but stay at Guadalupe, which was their name for Guadalupe, Victoria, in the meantime, to locate a cavalry company at La Bahia or Guadalupe that was under his overall command. He was to construct using lime, as directed by that geologist Raphael Chauvel, and he even wrote out advice about how to grow and process grain, and also the importance of daily rifle maintenance. He had a similar set of instructions for Raphael Chauvel. He wanted him to measure the latitude for the Lavaca anchorage to help plot it on future maps. He was to build a defensible structure. Raphael Chauvel was appointed at what they called the commissioner. So he was sort of like a business manager or construction manager kind of guy, not necessarily in the military, but in charge of some things. So he was to build this defensible structure at a flood-free site with fresh, healthful water. Questions about finding lime, clay, oyster shell, and whether to build with brick or wood with the assistance of skilled laborers from the Guadalupe or Austin's colony. Seek assistance from Martin de Leon about pastures and farming. Contact the commissioner at Bexar for funds if needed, and with knowledge that the state commander is informed of all of these plans. We have somewhat of a timeline here. These dispatches indicate that in late June, the schooner General Bustamante arrives at the Lavaca River with Captain Arteaga and 35 troops. On the 29th, they had disembarked and arrived at Guadalupe, Victoria, staying there for a few months. Perhaps they stayed there to scout the area and select the exact site for Barranco, Colorado. The schooner Constante arrives in July with munitions and 20,000 pesos and also some additional troops. In June and July, Mexican families as settlers were supposed to come from Zacatecas and trek overland to Guadalupe colony, recruited, by Tehran. They were to be joined and escorted by what they called the Third Active Company of Tamaulipas, or Tamaulipas, which was a cavalry company commanded by Captain Manuel Barberena, which then took up residence at Goliad. This unit became part of Arteaga's overall command and will move in January 1831 to Guadalupe, Victoria. So Arteaga that can then move and occupy the newly built Fort Barranco, Colorado. Part of the provisions of the law of April 6, 1830 said that convicts from Mexico were to be employed as laborers, at these new forts in Texas. So it appears like they shipped some of them in the fall of 1830, and they and some of the 11th and 12th Battalion went with them as their guards to this site that I'm talking about is Barranco, Colorado, and they apparently did construct a brick kiln. Some of the exchange was with Stephen F. Austin. For example, on the 6th of July, about a week after they arrived, Arteaga wrote to Steve F. Austin asking for laborers. And a few days later, Chauvel wrote to Stephen F. Austin. On the 13th, it's a very interesting letter that Stephen F. Austin writes back, very diplomatically explaining, that they don't have any laborers that are available. Everybody is working hard trying to establish their own places, and they don't have time to build a Mexican fort. It's a treat to read that and the diplomatic language that he uses, but he does promise to post the notice in the newspaper. And sure enough, this is the notice that gets published in the newspaper a few days later. It says here, a detachment of 40 men are shortly to be stationed at the mouth of the La Baca. A number of laborers and teams may get employed there to furnish timber and build houses. Notice will be given of the time when the work is to be commenced and how many hands can be employed, in order that those who may wish to engage may know when and to whom to apply. But the key here is it seems to be mentioning that they're going to build timber houses. And this may be why this so-called fort, was not found, decades later when this area was actually, settled and developed. They may have rotted, in our coastal climate by that time. So it might appear that nothing of brick, even though they built that kiln, ever really got built, like the fort at Anahuac. This is a chart that shows the habit of writing monthly military reports, that many of which are found in the Bear Archives. So you see here on the left, I have dates that are the first of each month, and the several types of reports that they seem to have written. I have myself tried to organize these, and they seem to have what I call a cover letter that is found, usually a few days after the first of the month, that explains what reports are attached. But because it has a date several days into the month, the reports themselves from the 11th Battalion, from the 12th Battalion, usually are dated the first of the month. And these cover letters are some days later. And the Bear Archives have all been resorted by date. So these are now no longer together in the Bear Archives. They've been separated out. So you can see here, this, say the 1st of September, 1830, it's in microfilm roll 134, and there's two of them, at two different points. And then the actual reports you can see are slightly earlier because they're dated, a few days earlier. The references that I list here that are still white, the cells are white, are ones that were written from Guadalupe, Victoria. And the ones in pink are the ones that show they're written from Barranco, Colorado. So you can see it took a few months, before they got established there. And then Arteaga himself moved in January of 1831, to Barranco, Colorado. The ones in green are this cavalry company under Barberena that was stationed at La Vaca, at La Bahia, that are shown in green. And then he switches to Guadalupe, Victoria, and then those are in white. It's at one point here, this unit gets ordered back to Matamoros because Tehran, if you remember the history, the revolution was starting in Mexico, where Santa Anna was trying to take power, and Tehran was of the party against him, and they met on the field of battle. So I think this unit was withdrawn to help, in that fight. There's a kind of document I call a summary. It's sort of like a tabular version of it's like a muster list. Then they have a strange document that they certify the attendance of Chauvel or Artiaga at the monthly review. Okay, and then we have this other one here, type, that again, it shows at Barranco, Colorado for a while, but at the very end, they go back to Guadalupe, Victoria. I don't know if I have sufficient detail in this presentation, but they really suffered in this time at Barranco, Colorado. Despite establishing, I'll show you where they were in a minute, but they tried to find a place with healthful water, basically some springs, but their sanitation may not have been the best, and they began to get sick, especially in the summertime. And Artiaga, was at his wit's end. He wasn't receiving pay for his soldiers. He wasn't getting supplies. They had constant desertions, and eventually he moved them back to Guadalupe, Victoria, which had a little bit more of an infrastructure with the civilian settlement there. So that's what these last few months show. I'll give you some hint at some of these things in the next few slides. Here is an example of some of the reports. You can see on the left is the report of the 11th Battalion, and it's basically a list of 1 second lieutenant and 22 soldiers that are present at Barranco, Colorado. In some of the notes down here at the bottom, we learned that 5 had been discharged in the prior month. The 12th Battalion looks like, it says here in this last column where they were. Some of them were on leave. Some of them were at Barranco, Colorado, probably as guards for the prisoners. And then some were stationed at Guadalupe, Victoria. There was a total of 4 officers and 55 soldiers, and they had had 1 death in that prior month. So the structure of these reports it's like a muster list, and then it has usually some comments of something that happened in the month prior to that first of the next month. So any significant events, they will sometimes mention. And then this is the monthly commissioner review, or a muster list, this summary. And this is actually a list of the convicts. So it lists 34 convicts are present at Barranco, Colorado, and 1 of them had died in this prior month before. So see, this was dated the 3rd of January, 1831. So there had been 1 death in December of 1830, more or less. And then I went through all of these, and I basically took a census from these and have tried to display it graphically here. You'll forgive me, I'm an engineer, I love graphs. But the grand total of military personnel at this post, counting both Guadalupe and Barranco, Colorado, is shown here in red with the square dots. Basically, they're taken from the monthly reports on those dates that you see across the bottom. So this lasted from, July 1830 to about August 1832. And you can see that Lynn was right. At one point, the total did exceed 200 for, maybe 4 or 5 months in here. This would have been in the summer to fall of 1831. And you can sort of see that infusions of troops at times, bumped this number up, and that it then fell away as they disengaged or abandoned the fort. The 11th Battalion is shown in blue. So you can see that those initial 40 or so, 35 came, and then those stayed for a while. And then they had an infusion of troops, and then it dropped away a little bit, and then they abandoned it. The 12th Battalion is shown in green. It looks like they had some come initially, and then some more, and then it gradually faded away. 3rd Company is in yellow. You can see here where they were ordered back to Mexico, and then there were none after that. The prisoners are in brown, you know, and again, they have some, and then over time they die or desert. And again, the red is the grand total. I've taken another graph here where I've taken off the red line so that the other lines can be expanded somewhat. And you can see the decline a little better here. The monthly reports are full of comments about deaths or desertions that happen. And you can see that, for example, the 12th Battalion had up here maybe as many as 63, 64 troops, and it fell away to, you know, almost 30. So it was almost like they lost half of their strength as they stayed at this fort for 2 years. The prisoners too dropped away, you know, until they were withdrawn. Where's the 12th? Yeah, the 12th Battalion is the green, the 11th is the blue. So, you know, they had some for a while, and then they had a big infusion, and then that dropped away, perhaps not quite as bad. But the dispatches are full of pleadings by Arteaga for supplies and medicines and complaints about you know, illness, which sounds like yellow fever. He actually mentions scurvy at one point. You know, so, you know, they just, it's like us camping for field school on the coast. In the, you know, it's not pleasant. Yeah, here I say the description seems to be malaria or yellow fever. And by 1832, they had also reported scurvy. Lack of funds for both pay and buying supplies locally was a constant problem. So Terran tried to build this military occupation of Texas, but he just never was given the resources to carry it out properly. You know, these reasons and the isolated location contribute to a steady stream of death and desertions among soldiers and convicts. Terran becomes preoccupied fighting a revolution in Mexico in 1832 against an upstart called Santa Anna. After defeats and the troubles in Texas with the Battle of Velasco and the similar engagements at Anahuac and Nacogdoches, he commits suicide in early June 1832. He was probably the most capable man to lead Mexico at this period, but he commits suicide. General Filisola, the assistant commander for Santa Anna in the Texas Revolution, wrote a memoirs some years later where he complained that Terran was actually assassinated by Santa Anna. But the weight of the evidence seems to suggest that he was, you know, what today we would call he suffered from anxiety or depression, and then he just committed suicide by falling on his sword. We even have some documents that show the list of goods that were confiscated from that Hedda. Remember, I mentioned that as one of the secondary reports in the summer of 1831. You can see here that the cases sometimes had brand marks on them. These little diamonds or initials were burnt onto the side of wooden crates. And there was quite a variety of goods that they just confiscated from the Hedda just because they thought they were bringing in some contraband. In this period of time, the importation of tobacco was against the law. You could grow it yourself, you could have it, but you couldn't import it. And that seems to be one of the flare points that's often considered contraband in those days. You know, in the spring of 1832, as the fever season hit, Arteaga got very frustrated, and he wanted to move back to Guadalupe, Victoria. But before that happened, it was time for his retirement and exit from Texas. So he wrote one of these dispatches, you know, and then Terran wrote back that his retirement was approved in April 1832. And then, perhaps caused by that, he moved his troops away from this remote location on the lower Lavaca River, you know, back to Guadalupe. Arteaga apparently became involved in passing information to his superiors about unrest among the Texians due to the Anahuac disturbances and the Battle of Velasco in June 1832. It seems like what is described is that travelers from the mouth of the Brazos or from as far over as Anahuac that were traveling back to Mexico or in that direction would pass through the area, and they would obtain information from them. And he was passing this back with dispatches to the commander in San Antonio de Bexar. But I think there's an interesting story here, you see, because unexpectedly, he and the majority of his command then declare support for the Santa Ana party. You know, just like the Texians did at Anahuac, Velasco, and even Victoria. And he secretly fled from Guadalupe with most of his troops. And he seems to have gotten aboard a vessel in Lavaca Bay, which was at the same time that this guy, you know, Jose Antonio Mejia, who had come from Tampico in response to the Battle of Velasco with 5 ships and 400 men, you know, sailed back down the coast. And I think secretly they communicated with him and got one of those ships to go into Lavaca Bay and pick them all up. So he turned on his commanders, who generally did not support the upstart Santa Ana party. They supported the existing Bustamante government, like Terran, like the commander in San Antonio, like the commander at Anahuac, you know, and so he escapes with the majority of his troops, except a few who didn't want to do this, stayed around and tried to control things as they abandoned the fort. One of the, you know, I don't know if y'all know Victoria, Texas very well, but the Old Town Center has streets named for the original, you know, Mexican impresario Martin de Leon and his 10 friends. And one of those streets was called Calle Arteaga, after Aniceto Arteaga. Today it's known as West Forest Street, you know, in downtown Victoria. This is a map drawn a few years after the abandonment of the fort by our old friend Berlandier. He returned to Texas a number of times. He had settled in Matamoros, and I think he was Swiss originally. And this is his drawing of Ruta de Goliad a Guadalupe y La Vaca. So it's the route of Goliad to Guadalupe and La Vaca. So you can see the town of Guadalupe, Victoria here on the San Antonio River, I believe. Oh, that's the Guadalupe. Yeah, the Guadalupe. And then you can see here the La Vaca River. They call it here Arroyo de la Vaca, you know, and he's got something here that's just called La Vaca, and he shows a couple of X's or tents, can't quite make them out, right there, you know, where Barranco, Colorado is. And there's a road from Guadalupe, Victoria, right to it. Okay, the Navidad is here. And you see Texana was formed some years later, right here. And so he pins down the location here. And if we can believe his curves, there's sort of a sharp curve, sharp turn here from a north section to an east section. And then it again proceeds southeast to the coast to Matagorda Bay, or this would actually be the top of Lavaca Bay as we know it today. The caption even uses the term Barranco Colorado again. And this is a blow up of that area, okay, with my little pretend flag. Let's segue to modern times. Where exactly was this fort? Okay. So this is an old-fashioned USGS map, somewhat better than the modern versions, which are drawn on a computer. This shows a section of the Lavaca River. It shows this sharp turn, this section that's running north and south to a section running east and west. There's a bluff, like Arteaga described. He wanted a high defensible location, and this bluff, as I'll show you in a minute, springs emanated from the base of this bluff and ran into the river. There is a set of springs just to the south off of this map called the Brick Factory Springs, which appears to relate to the bricks that were found here. People in Jackson County, when you talk to them, they say, "Oh yeah, that's the old brick factory. That's in 1937, my grandpa went over there and got a bunch of bricks for our flower bed." You hear a lot of stories like that. I've made this presentation to the Lake Jackson, not the Lake Jackson, the Jackson County Historical Commission, and this is where I heard a lot of this stuff. In the years of the Texas Revolution, just a few years, after this, there was a famous duel between two commanders. I think it was Albert Sidney Johnston and another guy named Houston. It wasn't Sam Houston. Forget his full name, but there's actually a historical monument at this point, and and further north, just off this map, is a map for Camp Independence, which was a training ground for some of the initial American volunteers to the Texas Revolution to train for a while. And there was a feud between these two of who was in charge, and they had a duel. And I think Albert Sidney Johnson was wounded in the hip. And, he went on to greater fame in the Texas Revolution, the Mexican War, and then even, of course, the Civil War, where I think he was killed at Shiloh. But just to orient you, that's sort of where we are. There is a modern road that comes, runs on this side of the river here in this red and white striped road. And there's a county road that runs off of it that comes down into the bottoms and crosses the Lavaca River here. And I have driven this whole area, and I'm amazed. The Lavaca River at this point is, I wouldn't call it a river. I'd call it more of a creek in a ditch. It's not a navigable river in my view. It's full of snags and in a deep ditch where only the bottom of that ditch, has water other than flood times. It's not, doesn't seem very deep. So this quad map had more details, more contour lines than some of the later maps. So I especially point out this bluff, right here, and this wooded bottomland. So they had fuel, timber for their structures, fuel for their campfires or cooking fires, and fuel for their kiln, the brick kiln. The springs came out at the base of this bluff. The area that charges those springs is here to the west, right where they built their fort. So I don't know what sanitation was like in those days, but this may have been the source of some of their illness difficulties. A modern book printed in 1981 called The Springs of Texas has these comments. It says the brick factory springs were on the west bank of the Lavaca River, 10 kilometers south of Edna, on Jane Reed's farm at latitude blah. The Mexican army was stationed here in 1831 and established a brick factory using the red clay from the 16-meter high bluff. Below the clay beds and close to the river are silt and sand beds from which small springs once flowed. The recharge area is 1 kilometer to the west, where these beds crop out at the surface. The springs have been dry for many years. Nearby are some bones of a mammoth, such as were hunted by the Paleo-Indian people. So this seems to describe that bluff, and Barranco Colorado means red red canyon or red ravine in English, referring to that red clay. Interestingly, there is a registered archaeological site called 41JK29 that was registered in 1967 with some very sparse comments. It says an open area on terrace above Lavaca River. Plowing has turned up lots of bricks. Neighbor boys throw in the river. Area of occupation 40 by 40, circa maybe. And the chairman of the Jackson County Historical Commission is a TAS member called Frank Condren. And I got to talking with him a couple of 3 years ago, and he added some comments to the file on this thing after our discussion. So this is Frank here, it's Frank Condren. It says, this doesn't make sense. So I think he's referring, is it 40 feet by 40 feet or 40 meters by 40 meters? Is that circa? You know, what exactly does this mean? It says, has been plowed for years. Bricks found about 1 foot subsurface, now disturbed and on surface. Old brick factory, Blair community from I.T. Taylor. And then Frank Condren adds, I.T. Taylor's book, The Cavalcade of Jackson County, is incorrect. The Blair community was quite distant from this site. Okay, so it appears like these brick were found and it was registered as an archaeological site, but due to the dearth of knowledge about Barranco, Colorado, no one connected the dots, you know, until now. So it appears like, you know, we know where this is, and it's a registered archaeological site. You know, so trying to bring this to a close, you know, I'll get to these in a minute, but, you know, let me say that I did talk with Frank Condren. You know, he seemed to know who the private landowner is today. He did talk to him, but he would never tell me much back in return. I think the guy, you know, didn't want anybody going in there, but just like Fort Velasco that we did a few years ago, I wanted to suggest, you know, a geophysical survey of this spot and see if we could establish where some of these wooden buildings and or brick kiln or brick factory, perhaps even some brick foundations of structures might have been, but that didn't seem to take hold. I mean, I would love to establish, you know, the extent of this site, and someday if we could find that, hey, it might be a site for a TAS field school, except of course it would be miserable in the summer. I think the STAA group, of which I have never really been a member, does have winter time field schools or projects. So let's go over it here to try to tell you what I've just told you. A substantial post or fort did exist in 1830 to 1832 on the west bank of the Lavaca River at a site 3 miles west of where the town of Santa Ana, later Texana, was established immediately following this period. Some of the 12th Battalion arrived in June 1830, staying initially at Guadalupe. 11th Battalion arrived by August and apparently posted also in Guadalupe. A group of 30 to 40 convicts arrived in September to erect a brick kiln with some soldiers as guards, I guess, at Barranco, Colorado. Arteaga himself moved himself and the remainder troops there in January 1831 as Barbarena came in from Goliad to take up residence in Guadalupe. Initial buildings were apparently constructed of timber or lumber, which may explain lack of structural remains in years afterwards. Nearby bottomland woods likely provided wood for the timber and also fuel. A substantial brick fort was apparently never completed. Local springs, known today as Brick Factory Springs, may have provided a healthful water supply. Dispatches continued for another 2 years from, as they write right on it, Barranco, Colorado, often indicating illness or lack of supplies until mid-1832. Most, if not all, Mexican soldiery was removed from East Texas in mid-1832, and this site was no different. But there was a little intrigue as Arteaga and most of his troops seemed to have wanted to get back to Mexico to fight on the Santa Ana side. This site and story have since been lost to history, but no longer, because I had nothing to do during my COVID hermitage. So I read, up to now, I have obtained over 400 of these Bear Archive documents and translated most of them, from Spanish in my own amateur way. And that brings me to the end of my presentation. I would love to take this presentation to the annual meeting. I understand it's going to be in Victoria this fall, because this is pretty close to that, perhaps partnering it with my Fort